Welcome to the Filibuster. This is the podcast of the Union University Political Science Department. The Senate filibusters the right to unlimited debate. But unlike the Senate filibuster, we will place a limit on our discussion, but yet we hope to also be, or at least to reflect the world's greatest deliberative body by being in a forum of civil debate and discussion of major issues from our academic, political, and Christian perspectives. The topic of our podcast today is the Israeli-Hamas War. I'm Sean Evans, and I am Chair and Professor of Political Science at Union, and I am the host of the podcast. Today, I'm joined by Seth Brake, the newest addition to the Political Science Department. Seth, welcome to the Filibuster.
Thank you very much.
All right, so we do have the right of unlimited debate, but let's not break any records here.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good. All right. Well, let's start off with some basic things that people need to know to understand this. What do we need to understand about Gaza and Israel's relationship with Gaza to understand what has been going on the past week or so?
Yeah. So Gaza is a very small patch of land with a very large number of people in it. So it's extremely densely populated. It's on the shore of the Mediterranean. The territory itself has been occupied by Israel at various times. It was once controlled by Egypt, but now it's kind of in this limbo state where it is considered broadly part of Palestine, but it is very much under the domination of the state of Israel.
All right. Who is Hamas?
So,
and where did they come from?
Yeah. So Hamas is it depends who you ask, right? Hamas is a terrorist organization in the eyes of most governments around the world, especially the United States government and Israel. But it's also an aspiring state actor. Hamas wants to represent the interests of all Palestinians broadly, but it really only has control and authority, as much as you can say it has authority over the area of Gaza. But that's a lot of people, and it's been more and more influential with time. Hamas is it's a Sunni group when you're looking at the terms of the divisions in Islamic politics. But despite that, it has increasingly been working with Iran. And that's kind of what makes that's the shadow that hangs over the events of the last few weeks there.
Okay, so you mentioned Iran here. Who are the other major political actors in this ongoing struggle?
Yeah. We can broadly conceptualize of the politics of the Middle East and Levant as sort of a Mexican standoff between three different parties. You know, the old trope of the three cowboy gunslingers facing each other in ongoing proxy wars between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And so there have been Israel-Saudi Arabia tensions at times in history. There have been Israel-Iran tensions, Iran-Saudi Arabia tensions. That triangle dominates the politics. Now, there are other important players we can talk about, but I think between those three, you can really understand the strategic dimension of what's happening. But in the last few years, the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia has been dramatically improving, which is historically extremely significant because the various Arab states Saudi Arabia is a very important actor in that group, so they can kind of lead the way. And both the Biden administration and the Trump administration made a priority of normalizing ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia because the U.S. has a positive relationship with both countries. And the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, has been active in that as well. And so it really looked like Israel and Saudi Arabia were going to be improving their relationship. But then if you think about the three-way tension, if two nodes of a three-way tension are starting to get friendly with each other, that's very bad news for the third node, Iran. And so that's what's really hanging over this. So you have a situation where two parts of a three-way conflict are becoming friendly with each other, and then an actor affiliated with the third part, the left-out party, suddenly takes this aggressive action. I think that's the light we need to take this into consideration. As far as other players, the U.S. is, a global superpower. They're going to be a player here, and as we've seen, they're taking we're taking lots of steps there, moving lots of equipment around. Egypt is another really important player because the Gaza Strip is bordered on one side by the sea, on two sides by Israel, and on the third side it's bordered by Egypt. And Egypt has at times controlled the Gaza Strip, but they don't want to control the Gaza Strip right now. And Despite the efforts of Israel and the United States, Egypt is refusing to take in refugees from the Gaza Strip. So that's the other side of this. The Rafah border crossing is one of the only places where you can enter and leave the Gaza Strip. That's the border with Egypt, and they are not letting people through that. So Egypt is another important player here. Turkey is the mystery player. Turkey has historically not had a great relationship with Israel, but Turkey is a NATO member. It's a close ally with the United States sometimes. And so Turkey is another player that could potentially be very important in this, but it's important to remember that they're really bogged down right now. They're active in the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict. They're trying to patrol the Black Sea in the middle of the Ukraine war. So it could be that their hands are too tied to worry too much about this, but they're another player that could be important. But for understanding the dynamics, it's Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran.
Well, just by what you've been saying, it reminds me so much of the importance of history. Persia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Pharaohs, Turkey, Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
So, I mean, you still have these dominant powers that go back centuries.
More than centuries.
Yeah,
You can read
yeah.
about these conflicts in the Bible.
Thousands
the Old
of
Testament.
years, yeah. Okay, well, there's one group you haven't mentioned, which kind of surprised me. What about the Palestinian Authority?
Well, the Palestinian Authority is... they're not Hamas, right? That's the interesting thing here. And the Palestinian Authority is the one that, in some ways, in international law, can help to delegitimize Hamas a little bit, because Hamas does not represent them, right? But they're recognized by many countries as being the legitimate government of Palestine, but not Israel, not the United States.
Okay, and what's the relationship between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority?
Well, the party that is in control of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas have been bitter enemies for a long time. However, often in statements, they will both try and emphasize the solidarity with the Palestinian people, things like that. So it's a similar cause, but very different approaches and very different interests.
Okay, so why did Hamas launch such a huge attack now?
That's a big question.
I hope that you have a big answer here.
Well, I can tell you how I read it, and that's the best I can do.
Good.
But the nature of the normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia as such a big threat to Iran is something that it was essential to Iranian interests that be disrupted, and we have increasingly been treating Hamas as if it is affiliated with Iran. They're getting funding from Iran, things like that, which has historically not always been the case. In fact, in the Syrian civil war, Hamas and Hezbollah, which is the group we usually associate with being backed by Iran, were on opposite sides.
Yeah, and Hezbollah is located in southern Lebanon.
Southern Lebanon and Syria. Yeah. And also in Iraq, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. So Hezbollah is a very large group, and they are strongly connected with Iran. But Hamas also has been funded by Iran lately. And so, as far as the timing of this, it really does seem calculated to disrupt the normalization of Israel-Saudi Arabia relationships. And if that's the goal from Iran's perspective, it's already worked. Saudi Arabia is talking to Iran again. They're having meetings. They have put out statements in support of the Palestinian people, things like that. So Saudi Arabia, this really has disrupted that. So I think we have to consider that as part of it. But the other side of this is that in recent years, Hamas has been, when you have terrorist groups, there's a struggle between terrorist groups to make sure that they can portray themselves as being the proper representative of the cause. This is something that happens in a lot of conflicts with asymmetric warfare and terrorist strategies. And one of the things that terrorists have to do, we call this outbidding, where a terrorist group needs to demonstrate that it is the superior representative of a cause. And so this is why they kind of compete with each other to advertise their ability, their strength, their power, things like that. And so any large body count after a terrorist attack is something that advertises that terrorist group as the one to watch. This is something that, if you remember a few years ago, ISIS was very good at this. They had really good PR because they would publicize their brutal attacks, and that showed them as, the predominant terrorist group for their cause. And I think Hamas was in a similar situation. They had been viewed over time as kind of defanged. People started to, when they talked about Hamas, they started to talk about Hamas as the more reasonable of the terrorist groups, the more institutional one that maybe could become a legitimate power over time. And that's not good PR. That's not good press for a terrorist group to have. So there are reasons why they needed to do something big, but I think the bigger explanation, the one that makes more sense to me for explaining these things, is disrupting the normalization of Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so the fact that they breached the barrier, they've killed many people. They kidnapped them. What's the significance of this for Israel?
Well, like any state, the legitimacy of the state is deeply tied to its ability to protect its people. But even more so for the state of Israel, because history hangs so heavy over the state of Israel. It was founded, the current iteration was founded after World War II with the idea of preventing violence against the Jewish people. The fact that we have this massive attack with so many civilians killed is a serious blow to the legitimacy of the state, because what Hamas was saying was, you can't protect your people. We can cross the border, we can initiate this horrible, brutal slaughter, and there's nothing the government can really do about it. Now, the government is now doing everything it can to say, oh, we can do something about it. Look at all these airstrikes, but the legitimacy of both the state and the government are in question here. I mean, this is not good for Netanyahu's government, because he doesn't look good as the security-focused, more right-wing politician if terrorist attacks are happening on your watch. That's terrible for your politics. But it's also just a blow to the identity of the state itself. This is a legitimacy question. It's a very serious. In many ways, it's similar to the 9/11 attacks in our history, in that you have this moment where the people feel vulnerable and angry, right? They need a response, and I think that's very much the situation that Israel is in. But it's a little more acute than that, if you can imagine, because we have the history of the Holocaust hanging over them. I mean, the rhetoric that you hear about this attack so often is, they're saying that this is the greatest loss of Jewish life in a single day since the Holocaust, and I don't know if I can verify if that's technically true, but it's very alarming to hear. And so that goes right back to the core of the mission of the state of Israel.
Okay, you've mentioned a little bit about legitimacy, and maybe this is something that we can discuss later, and if so, we can punt. But what does this do to Israel's deterrent ability? They are surrounded by actors who are antagonistic to them, and the idea is Israel has always been the nation to where if you attack them, they're going to give as good as they get and then some. Does this weaken them in the eyes of other Middle Eastern actors?
I think most of the political effects here are actually going to be domestic in terms of weakening legitimacy, because it really depends what happens next, right? Right now, no. I don't think the attack itself did that, but let's say they go into Gaza and they're unable to control it. What if they get driven out of Gaza or have huge casualties? Then maybe stuff like that will become relevant. But I think right now that's not in play yet. But it very well could be. I mean, we have so many looming fronts and conflicts facing Israel right now that's those sort of questions could come up, but I don't think we're there yet.
Okay, let's kind of look a little bit at the Israeli domestic side in a way. How did something like this happen? Why wasn't Israel prepared? I mean, that's something that threatens, I would think, the legitimacy of the Netanyahu government. But how did this happen? I mean, Yeah,
well, this is the question everyone's asking. I won't be able to give you a definitive answer on that, but I can say that they were surprised. And there has been talk. I mean, Egypt claims that they warned the Netanyahu government that some kind of attack was coming, but it's very much similar to the conversations we have around 9/11 there as well, because, when you have so much information, it's hard to know what's a valuable thing and what's not, right? So, I don't know what the intel situation on that is, but you were talking about decreasing perceptions of Israeli capability. They do have a very good reputation for having a good intelligence service, and maybe that part of their reputation is degraded. But this is a question that's being asked a lot in Israel's domestic politics.
Well, let me say this. There's been a lot of internal division within Israel over the Netanyahu's government proposed reforms to the Supreme Court. Was this a little bit of, Hamas was thinking Israel is divided, now is the time to strike, or since the security forces and the intelligence forces really oppose these changes, is there anything about that people got distracted here?
I would really be surprised if Hamas's tactical choices and strategic choices had much to do with domestic Israeli politics. I think their audience is very much more the wider Arab world.
Okay, so What does Israel declaring war on Hamas mean?
Well, in terms of international law, not a lot. It's not a formal declaration of war against another state, right? But it is it's a very serious deployment. They have mobilized 300,000 reservists. I think there's something like 500,000 soldiers now at their disposal in some way. They're moving so much equipment around. They're militarizing both the north and the south border because there's the threat from Hezbollah, right? The state of Israel also has formed a unity government in the face of this threat. So, all those internal things you're talking about, they're all on the back burner now because Israel very much views this as an existential threat. This isn't some internal issue to put down. This isn't some foreign policy issue. This is the survival of the state and the people in question. And I think sometimes we miss that context because it looks so asymmetric to us. We see Israel with this modern, powerful military, and we think none of these terrorist groups really pose a threat to them. But when you look at the state Israel's in right now, I mean, even just digging Hamas out of Gaza is going to be a extremely difficult operation. I'm not sure that that's something they're capable of right now. And then you have the threat of Hezbollah on the other border, which is bigger and better funded than Hamas, and marching to Iran's orders. Right, this is something that could, in many ways become a very bad situation for Israel. So they're taking this as seriously as a nation can take anything. That's what the declaration of war is supposed to demonstrate, both to the Israeli people that we are united and capable, but also to the rest of the world that Israel is on a wartime footing here.
So, what choices does Israel have to respond here?
So, the first question is whether to invade Gaza. They've been saying from the very beginning that that's their plan, that that's something they're preparing for, but they haven't done it yet. So the choice of whether or not to invade Gaza is complicated because if they don't invade Gaza, again, there's that internal problem. Can they show that they're supporting them? They lose legitimacy there. Also, if Israel is not able to crush Hamas in some really tangible way, you probably will see changes in the way that the Israeli people behave. Like, could it be possible that people might move away from the border? Right, and settle that area less. It's possible, and that may not seem very important, but when you have issues over territory, where people choose to live is everything. Because if people move away from that border, now there's a lower cost to a future Israeli government to giving up territory. Right, so people moving around, that changes future strategic calculations. So Israel's looking at the future, not just the present. They have to choose an action that doesn't change any of those negotiating things, or they're going to lose in the future. So that would decrease future bargaining power over land. Because it's much harder to make that claim if your people have left. So they have to do something. Right now, they're just bombing. That kind of it is a devastating bombing that's going on there. There are huge numbers of civilian casualties. There was an attack last night where a hospital was hit and something like hundreds of people are dead. Now there's some controversy about who actually hit the hospital. Now Israel's maybe claiming that it wasn't them, but regardless, more people have died now in Gaza than died in the attack on Israel. This is a really dramatic thing. So they probably are preparing for some kind of invasion. But why haven't they done it yet? Why haven't they started yet? These are all things that are up in the air. But if they do choose to go in, that was the line that Hezbollah drew. They said, if Israel enters Gaza, now Hezbollah will get involved in the war. Now, is that a credible commitment? I don't know, right? Probably not. But it is a serious threat that Israel can't take lightly. So they're weighing entering Gaza, possibly activating Hezbollah, bringing in, expanding the conflict into Lebanon, because if you're going to be fighting Hezbollah, you have to fight in Lebanon. So now we're bringing in another state. Now, the state of Lebanon is not as important as Hezbollah here because they're having all sorts of internal problems, right? But that expands it to another country. That brings Iran a step closer to being directly involved, not just indirectly involved. So that question is surely a heavy one, but with the way they're talking, if they don't go into Gaza, that's going to be a big credibility problem for them. One of the main things that states have to demonstrate in international diplomacy is, credibly committing to following through on threats. And if Israel says we're going into Gaza, that they have to do something at some point that makes it look like they can follow through on that threat. So that's a serious part of that decision.
Okay. Real quickly, you've mentioned Gaza on the west, Hezbollah in the north. What's the probability of an uprising in the West Bank? Because that has to be the worst case scenario for Israel.
Yes, that's the worst case scenario. It is hard to know right now because that in that area, Hamas is weaker, right? But if people are agitated enough, you could start to get things like that. So I don't know if I can put a probability on it, but everything that heatens this conflict increases the probability, right? Everything that raises the temperature. So getting involved in Lebanon raises that temperature. Invading Gaza raises that temperature. And I think the real effect of that threat is it means that Israel cannot afford to put as many troops toward the Gaza direction, right? Because they're going to have to patrol even further borders. And that is a really complicated, complex border to patrol with the West Bank. So I don't know what the probability of that is, but it's got to be part of the conversation.
Okay, so tell me more about an invasion of Gaza, because I look at it and I have to say, this has to be one of the worst things that you can do.
Yeah.
I think about the urban warfare that we saw in Iraq and we see currently in Ukraine.
Yeah.
The impact it has on civilians. The fact that there are tunnels underground that Hamas knows to use and Israel may not know where they're at. I know with the U.S., we had strong support when we first went in, but when casualties started to come in, and the longer it went on, the less popular the war came. Is this something that Israel has to worry about, or the civilian casualties? You said that Egypt has closed the border, which really increases the probability of civilian casualties, which puts more world pressure on Israel.
Yeah, there's a couple different layers to that question. So the first one, just about the difficulties of urban combat. This isn't just urban combat. This is probably some of the densest urban combat you can imagine. So even after extensive bombing campaigns, and maybe even because of them, you can hide in rubble just as much as you can hide in a building, right? It's a nightmarish scenario to imagine going in there. Israel will be expecting large casualties. The other side of that, though, you ask about the effect that casualties has on domestic politics. There is a difference. The U.S., in our experience, when we've had those conflicts and we have had responses to that, we were not fighting a war that involved any of our territory. And the research shows that resolve is much, much different when there's your own territory involved. I think the fact that that Israel is framing this as a survival struggle for their nation, the fact that they're on territory that is, right next to their territory, very much an Israeli territorial concern, even if Gaza is not Israeli territory, very much still a territorial concern. I think that they will have much higher resolve in terms of being able to absorb losses. Very similar to what we see going on in Ukraine, actually, right? We would have expected that Russia and Ukraine both would have gotten exhausted by casualties much sooner. They haven't yet, and that's because they're fighting that kind of conflict as well. But one of the big differences is when you have a massive urban conflict in Bakhmut in Ukraine, the people can leave, right? And they do. Yeah. I mean, that city's gone. It's flattened, right? But the civilians were able to flee as the conflict began to heat up around it. But that's something you can't do in Gaza. The Israeli government is trying its hardest to get the people of Gaza to evacuate down to the south. But that's over 1 million people that they're trying to move in a very short period of time. That's just not going to happen. And then that would be difficult even if Hamas was cooperating. But Hamas is not. Hamas is doing everything they can to try and keep people from leaving because again. This gets into the Hamas. We haven't talked as much about Hamas's strategy, but civilian casualties are not bad for Hamas. So this is just a nightmarish situation for Israel.
Okay, so we mentioned the choice of invading Gaza.
Yeah.
Are there other choices available to Israel?
Yeah, there's the choice of what kind of bombing to do. Right. It seems like the bombing campaign so far has been targeted at knocking out the leadership of Hamas, and they have been largely successful. But there's always a trade-off between the effectiveness of your bombing campaign and how much you have to care about civilian casualties. And Israel has not been has not shown much restraint this time. In the past, in some of these conflicts, Israel has shown a lot of attempts to avoid civilian casualties. They're very accustomed to this kind of fighting. They'll do warnings before attacks, things like that. They're not doing as much of that in this, and the bodies are piling up in a really horrific fashion because of the seriousness of the conflict, things like that. But it's a very it's very sobering to look at those numbers. But one of the questions that they're facing is what kind of bombing campaign are we going to run? What kind of bombs are we using? We've seen them increasingly using unguided weapons. That might show that they're just running out of bombs. They've dropped thousands of bombs on Gaza. I think a few days ago the count was up to 7,000 bombings. I don't know what it's up to now, but that is a massive amount of just in terms of material, that's a massive amount of bombs to drop on a small area. Maybe their bombs are getting depleted there too. Maybe they're trying to reserve some of those things for future operations. But once they do go in, if they go in, they're going to need a lot of air support. That's going to require further munitions. Is there going to come a point where they depend on the U.S. delivering further munitions? I don't know, right? Like that's the question that hangs over all this. So what kind of bombing campaign to do? But then also, let's say that they make it through this. Let's say that they enter Gaza, they're successful in driving Hamas out of the top. And then what do? Do they just pull back, give it back, let them rebuild, yeah. Right? This is a question. They have occupied Gaza before. It did not go that great for them. Do they try and institute some sort of election again? In 2006, they tried to promote elections in Gaza, and that's when Hamas was voted in. Are they going to try and look for a democratic solution there? Like, what to do after a successful invasion is also a really complicated series of questions that is just as thorny as the question of whether to invade or not.
Okay, let's hold off on those because I think that's something we'll get to in a bit. Okay, we've talked about what Israel's choices are. Mm-hmm. What are Hamas's choices here? Well,
Hamas is in a... we already talked about the outbidding problem, where Hamas needs to demonstrate that they are the Palestinian group, right? But there's also, and we've talked about the spoiling motivation. So in the studies of terrorism, sometimes they call that a spoiler attack, where you do an attack to make some peace deal less likely. That's something else that Hamas needs to do. But as a terrorist group, the other thing that Hamas needs to be able to accomplish is costly signaling. They need to demonstrate resolve in a way that that shows that they are resistant to two things, that they're resistant to their own losses and then civilian losses, right? And I think that they are doing everything they can right now to signal that they have absolutely no concern for civilian casualties in Gaza, that they have no, in fact, it's quite the opposite. Hamas benefits from civilians dying because one of the other fundamental aspects of terrorist strategy is provocation. You have to take steps to provoke the state that you're antagonistic toward into responding in a way that harms the civilians in the place where you're stationed. The goal there, that drives recruitment for the terrorist group. It increases their reputation, but also in this case, what's really big is international support.
Right.
So the Arab world is very invested in the plight of the Palestinian people, and this is something that poses a problem for Saudi Arabia with their relationship with Israel, but also, this is felt all over the Arab world. And the more civilians that die in Gaza, the more support for Hamas is going to be there, both in Gaza for their own recruitment, but also outside of it. And then thinking long term, Hamas needs one of the biggest problems for a group like Hamas is that during peacetime they have a hard time with recruitment. Especially if the area they're in has a thriving economy, because they're competing with the job market to recruit those terrorists, right? To recruit those fighters. So Hamas needs a long-term situation where life is not dramatically improving in Gaza, but also where they are the only ones who are capable of providing the public goods that a state does. So the type of post-conflict environment that would help Hamas would be one where you have lots of people in a terrible situation for a long period of time, and Hamas with high reputation. So I think so far everything's playing directly into Hamas's hands with regard to that. As long as some of their leadership survives, they will be in a better position than they were at the end of this.
Okay, so what is the United States doing so far, and what should it do moving forward?
Well, we just learned today that the president is making a visit. President Biden is going to be visiting Israel. That's a big show of support. When the head of state visits a country in the middle of conflict, right? That is a strong show of support. It's also a credible commitment and signal, and costly signal, because you're the diplomatic effort of moving into a conflict area, it's very expensive. It's a big show of support. Also, it in some ways puts members of your leadership at risk. I don't think anyone's going to be taking pot shots at Biden, but the threat is there, right? Like the possibility is there. So that's a huge symbol of commitment. But we have a near unprecedented military response as well. The amount of naval equipment that is being moved over there, like right now, we've moved the Gerald Ford and the whole naval strike group. So that's let's see, that's thousands of sailors, many ships, several guided missile destroyers, things like that. This is a large section of the Navy, and that's just one strike carrier battle group. We're moving another one. The Dwight D. Eisenhower is also moving with its support group, and that's, I think, it's in the Mediterranean now, but it's headed in the same direction. So 2 battle groups is a massive naval support. But then we're also moving we're moving in Marines. There's the Bataan, the USS Bataan is moving from Kuwait into that area, which is going to bring something like almost 2,000 soldiers in there as well. So this is a very large movement of naval capability, and it's a very dramatic display.
Okay, why? Why are we doing this?
Well, that's another complicated question. The conventional answer is that this is an attempt to deter Iran, because we have no problem striking targets in Syria and maybe even Lebanon if we had to, right? So this is something that would not cause an international problem for the United States. So we could credibly say, in the event of escalation, if Hezbollah got involved in the conflict, maybe the U.S. could do something. So this is about deterring Iran, but it's also probably about a lot more than that, because realistically, I think you only need one of those carrier groups to deter Iran, right? This is a really dramatic display. It's probably, in a weird way, it's probably a warning to our good friend Turkey, to make sure that they are. Well, Turkey's hands are tied right now. They're busy with the Black Sea and the conflict in Armenia, Azerbaijan, but Turkey has had conflicts with Israel in the past, and they have a naval presence. So just a reminder to our good NATO friend that we've got this. Is a big part of that, because also, they brought elements of the Greek Navy with them across the Mediterranean. If you know anything about the history of Turkey and Greece, that's a signal, that's a statement, right?
And that seems to me significant that a NATO ally is willing to help the U.S. in this, because Europe has was supportive and then has backtracked a little bit. So the fact that Greece is participating is significant.
Yeah. That is the NATO club, doing its thing, but Turkey's part of that,
Right.
So, it's a very big display there. Also, this does give us some influence over Israel as well, because with some of the reconnaissance and radar support that those ships can give, that's I'm sure of huge benefit to Israel, but that also means that we're going to have more of a say. So one of the things that's been talked a lot in the press in the last few days is that the U.S. is trying to get Israel to maybe supply water to South Gaza, stuff like that. Also maybe trying to prevent further escalation from Israel into like Lebanon or something like that. The U.S. is we're the status quo power. We want things to remain as static as possible, right? We wouldn't like this to escalate into a regional war. So this allows us to put pressure on Israel as well.
Okay, so what should the U.S. do going forward?
That's such a problem. This gets into the thorniest part of this from the U.S. perspective, because there are now 2 big conflicts in 2 different regions of the world that we have a very big interest in. Ukraine is still ongoing. It's as hot as ever. And Ukraine has been a central part of U.S. foreign policy for the last year. And, we have a hard enough time getting enough weapons and munition to Ukraine. If we have to start supporting Israel in a long fight in Gaza, that's going to be a huge strain on U.S. resources. And these are 2 countries that are just non-negotiable, 2 conflicts that are non-negotiable for the United States. So, can we credibly support both of these partners in both of these conflicts at the same time? That's a tough question. If we have to, and that's probably part of what all these carriers and ships are supposed to be doing, right? To show that there are other kinds of support we can give, other types of, influence we can exert, because those naval assets have not been as much what we're doing in Ukraine, obviously, because we don't, we're not going to be operating in the Black Sea as much. So, maybe this is us trying to say, well, a different branch can handle this one. But it's a tough situation, because now there's 2 really crucial conflicts where we are trying to support one side in their battle, and we really need both of our friends to win.
Okay, so we're going to support both then. That's the
we have to, yeah.
Policy. Okay. Well, from what we have heard is that we are depleting our munitions reserves. Yeah. And this, I would think, would deplete it even faster. So if we're at a point and we have to choose, who do we choose between Ukraine and Israel?
Well, there's two different ways of thinking about this, and I think they both come down with different answers. In terms of just raw strategic interest, Ukraine is the more important conflict. Containing Russia, protecting Europe, keeping our NATO allies strong in that fight, maintaining the non-conquest norm and the liberal world order and all that is central to the Ukraine conflict. Thankfully, the survival of the Ukrainian state, I don't think is as much in question. But if the U.S. is unable to keep supporting them, would that still be the case? I'm not sure. But very much world order issues are at stake there. So as far as strategic interest goes, Ukraine's the more important one. But that's not all that a country has to consider. I think that in terms of the public salience, public support, and interpersonal ties, I think Israel is much closer to U.S. knowledge and interest and care, right? The individual American citizen probably knows more about Israel, cares more about Israel, will put more pressure on their politicians to care more about Israel. So we're probably facing a difference between salience and strategic interest here. But both are hugely important. If there's a both answer, we'll take it. But if we have to privilege one or the other, a lot of it, that's almost an electoral question. How close is the next election? How much do people care about that? How much communication is going on between the people and their representatives? Because there's a strategic and public opinion difference there probably.
Okay. Are there any situations that you can think of that the U.S. would use military force?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have when it was required by our strategic interests, we have absolutely no problem bombing Syria. We do it all the time, right? There are Hezbollah bases in Syria that we could hit. We have intervened like that before. We could do it again. That is something that I think we can credibly threaten to do. I do think we would like to avoid a full-on confrontation with Iran. That's something that I would guess Iran wants to avoid as well. So we would probably limit ourselves to hitting proxy forces, but it's certainly something that is not out of the question for us to do. Also, just supplying weapons is something that we probably will be doing. Yeah.
Okay, so if you see the U.S. taking military action, it will be toward Hezbollah.
That would be my guess.
Not toward
but
Hamas.
We are in a pretty wild situation. It could escalate fairly rapidly in ways that maybe I can't predict. But if I were guessing right now, I would think that the most plausible use of direct U.S. force would be against Hezbollah.
Can you see troops on the ground in Israel?
Probably not.
Okay.
It would take a real escalation of some kind for stuff like that, I think.
Okay, it seems one of the thorniest things that both Israel, the U.S., and other nations face is the hostage situation.
Absolutely.
I've read that there's between 150 and 250
Yeah, I think the last time I saw was 199, so yeah.
Yeah, okay, and there are about 20 U.S. hostages. And as we know with ISIS, they did not treat hostages well. So if you're Israel and the U.S., how do you handle this?
Yeah, you want to tread delicately when you're talking about this because this is people's lives currently at stake. But it is a bad place to be in the hands of a terrorist organization with the kind of incentives Hamas has. I want to say that the reason that Israel is being so cautious about going into Gaza is maybe they're coming up with some sort of extraction plan there. But it's a dark situation. I don't think that, realistically speaking, there are any strategic level goals that Israel would sacrifice to save hostages. That's just the nature of the situation. I think Hamas knows that the biggest value those hostages have is in the way they can influence the publics involved. So as the conflict escalates, this could go to some really tragic places. I do think this is another reason why the U.S. attention on this is going to be so heavy because there are U.S. citizens there. And, in the same way that Israel's legitimacy is tied to its ability to protect its citizens, so is the United States. It's a little different in that they weren't in U.S. soil when they were taken, but we still want to protect our people, things like that, And it's not just the U.S. and Israel. I mean, many countries have people as hostages now and people who died in the attacks, right? It's a very serious situation there, but in terms of the actual strategies and outcomes, I don't know how much it actually changes at the end of the day.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the impact on the region and the world. So we've talked a little bit about the impact on the peace process. Yeah. We've talked about the choices between Ukraine and Israel. But when we go back to the Israeli-Arab problems in the 1960s and 70s, what happened was oil politics to where Saudi Arabia and OPEC decided we're just going to stop selling oil to the U.S. and other nations. What are the chances that we will see oil politics play a role in this? Yeah,
some of the oil exporting Arab states have already talked about it, about trying to use, stop oil export as protest. But that is a less important part of the economy now. There are other places to get oil now. The Middle East is not the world center of oil production anymore. It's still a big part of the oil market, but it's not as important as it used to be. So I'm sure that'll still be part of it. But also, U.S. firms make a lot of money off of high oil prices now too. So it's not the dire threat that it used to be, even though it still matters.
Well, and the fact, yes, but if we see a cutback in the Arab world, we see the cutbacks in Russia for obvious reasons. That means we're also buying from states like Venezuela, who we don't really want to be giving money to. So, I mean,
yes, but we are in new negotiations.
Politics
about that.
here are very interesting.
For sure.
Okay, let's talk about long term.
Okay.
Is a two-state solution still the solution, or is there something else to undermine the appeal that a group like Hamas has among Palestinians?
Well, in the most ideal scenario, there probably is a world where something like that works, but the path to get there is increasingly difficult to see. Because it really is hard to run an organization like Hamas in an environment that has a lot of foreign direct investment, a lot of economic activity, economic growth, a good job market, things like that. That doesn't make people less sympathetic to the terrorist cause, but it does make running the terrorist organization a lot more expensive, which means they have to raise more money, which means they're less effective in general. So there probably is a world where that can be solved. We laugh about sometimes trying to think that throwing money at problems can solve them, but in these issues, sometimes they really can. I mean, the relationship between the Camp David Accords, resolved a lot of the tension between Israel and Egypt, and a big part of that was shoveling money, right? Like there are answers to these types of problems. There's no deep ethnic hatred so deep that greed can't overcome it, right? But the problem is there's probably no. Well, okay, so we talk about one state solution sometimes, right? Where, could there be a situation where, everybody's in a big happy republic voting, right? That's just that's something that the Israeli public will never countenance because, this gets into the definition of the nation. Like in the United States, we don't like to think in terms of nation states and ethno states because so much of our political ideology and heritage is built around opposing that, right? But in Israel, we really do have a nation state in the old sense. We have a defined cultural group and then a state that we think ought to represent their interests. Now, Israel has been better than some about that, in that, Arab and non-Jewish members have just the same rights as others if they're citizens, but they want to keep that ratio under a lot of control. So I just can't see the reason why Israel doesn't just conquer the places they conquered is because they don't want the people, right? So I don't think you're ever going to see Israel willing to take something other than a two-state solution or this long, awkward thing. But neither side right now would say they want a two-state solution and can say they want a two-state solution because this is just an unsustainable long-term conflict. And both sides have irreconcilable territory claims. Both sides have so much bad blood over history, things like that, that I think that any of those solutions right now are just looking more and more unlikely. So I can't imagine a situation where you can get to that situation, but the equilibrium where, these things are being solved by economic growth, it's possible. I just don't know how we get there.
Okay. Are there other regional and world implications that we need to consider here?
Well, again, we can't understate the importance of the fact that this has undermined the normalization of the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the proxy war between Iran and Israel continues on apace. I mean, that's not stopping. But I think we're seeing a situation where a lot of dormant conflicts are flaring up. Obviously, this is a big one. Obviously, I mean, there's nothing quite as big as the war in Ukraine on that front with the Russian invasion. But we mentioned earlier the Azerbaijan and Armenia conflict that flared up a month ago and is still simmering. That's probably not resolved. There are other places. There was recently a terrorist attack in the Balkans. We know that that's kind of a hotbed sometimes. But another big question in all this is what's China doing in all this? What's China thinking about this? I think a lot of times we want to assume that China is just blanket opposed to U.S. interests in the world, but I think that it's more complicated than that, because China is not in a position where they would benefit dramatically from the revisions that revisionist states like Russia are proposing to the international system, right? So if we had a world where the world regionalized, where different powers, established their spheres of influence, like back in the pre-World War I international order, things like that, I'm not convinced that that's great for China, and because their growth so much depends on the international economy as well. China is in a really complicated situation here, and of course, the thing that's on everyone's mind is Taiwan. China has been saying for so long that a lot of their domestic legitimacy lies on the Taiwan question, being able to promise they will one day retake Taiwan. They know they're on a ticking clock with that. They're also on a ticking clock with their demographic problems, right? The much discussed demographic collapse that China will experience in the next 20 years is something that they know about as well. So there's a sense in which China might currently be at the height of their power, right? And we know that when states think that the international system is going to change such that they are disadvantaged in the future, they're incentivized to take dramatic action.
The Thucydides trap.
It's partially the Thucydides trap in that you have the two empires, right? The rising and the declining power. Right. But there's also just the short-term game theory of decline, right? That poses a problem. However, at the same time, Ukraine has showed us that there is a pretty significant cost to that kind of operation right now. I think that China is observing the losses that Russia is taking. I think that is factoring into the fact that they have not moved on Taiwan yet. So I don't know what China is going to do in all this. What I do know is that probably our worst case scenario is some conflict reigniting in Asia, because now we've got the European conflict, the Middle Eastern conflict. If there's one in Asia, we're already wondering if we can support two. If we have to support a third, that's bad news. So I don't know what China's going to do in this. Hopefully nothing, right? Because again, their incentives are lined up with the current system more maybe than a regionalized system. Yeah. And so that's kind of what I'm wondering with that. But I was wondering if maybe I could probe you a little bit on some of the U.S. domestic things going on in this conflict, because we're talking about the strain on U.S. munitions, on the U.S. military, things like that. I mean, is there any appetite for funding a second war?
Okay, I don't think there's appetite for funding a war, but I do think there is a strong belief among Republicans that we need to boost domestic defense spending, because we are thinking if we're going to be involved, our supplies, which used to be like 2 years, I think, is down to several months. And so there are already those saying that we need to increase defense spending and we need to rebuild our defense production facilities so that we can do that. And that's also another word for jobs. And so that's something to where I think both sides on Democrats and Republicans could buy into. One side because it's industrial policy, the other side because they're big on defense.
Is that a partisan issue?
in terms of rebuilding.
Is this something that's going to become a hot button issue in the next election? Is this something that we're going to see the parties differ on? Because in our polarized system, it seems like anytime something's up in the air, one party has to take one side, one has to take the other. Is that going to happen with defense spending?
I think we could see the Republican raising that as an issue. It also depends upon who's going to be the Republican nominee. I mean, Trump doesn't care about what's going on in the world strategy or everything else. If he sees a weakness, he's going to go after it. But by the same token, I also think if you're a Trump supporter, part of the idea also is you want a strong America, and so that means you need a strong national defense so that you can scare off anybody so that nobody messes with the U.S. of A.
You mentioned who the Republican nominee is going to be. Do you think that these issues are going to hang over the Republican primary race?
At this point, I don't think so. I mean, we saw where former President Trump said that Hamas's attack was very smart. I mean, that was a inappropriate comment. I mean, Hamas's attack on these civilians was evil incarnate. But we have to remember, for Trump, inappropriate comments are par for the course. And the simple fact is, I think most people have made up their mind about Trump one way or the other. And I think this is just going to confirm one side's view of this is why he should not be in power. On the other side, they say it's just Trump being Trump. We support him for other reasons. What's going to be more important, I think, is going forward is if it becomes closer to the voting, when people start paying more attention, I think it could potentially be a role there. But is this something that's going to mobilize a lot of Republican primary voters to oppose Trump? I'm a little bit doubtful of.
That makes sense.
Now, I do think it helps Nikki Haley in the sense to where she's kind of getting is trying to coalesce the anti-Trump supporters behind her. She's strong on foreign policy. It might help her gain some support. It will definitely help her with donors. Right. But whether there are enough people who would vote for her based on this, I think is doubtful. I think it helps her become the alternative to Trump, but that still doesn't mean she can get enough votes to defeat Trump.
That makes sense. We're talking about spending money. We're talking about budgets, defense spending, things like that. Those go through the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives does not have a speaker right now. Do these things affect the speaker race at all? Do the different candidates for the Republican speakership have different positions on this?
I think there is across the board support for Israel in the GOP. The concern is with Ukraine. There is not as much support among House Republicans for Ukraine, and so I think if House Republicans have a choice, they'll choose Israel over Ukraine.
Right, and that gets into that tension we were talking about earlier. Right. Now, there have been a lot of interesting conversations around the domestic response to this conflict, the different sides, right? How does this affect our polarizing politics when we have the far left and the far right saying maybe some inadvisable things about the conflict?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of key things to look at. One is when some of the people on the far right say crazy things, it's not always challenged, or it's not always challenged forcefully and consistently. On the left, the squad, the college students, and some universities made just some ill-advised things. They got instant responses across the board from Democrats, and so that keeps the crazy down a bit on the left more than the right. But I think what's also important in this is there are more people on the left who are saying positive things about the Palestinian cause. I think we can say you can have empathy for Palestinians, but you should not have sympathy for Hamas. But I think if you look at younger people, especially on the left, they're more pro-Palestinian. And so what is going to be interesting is what is U.S. policy toward Israel 20 years from now when there are fewer pro-Israeli Democratic politicians. And so I think there's going to be greater tension among the Democrats with this.
Well, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Well, any last comments about anything? I'll give you the final word.
Yeah, I'll say one more thing, because reacting to this from a Christian perspective, I think sometimes it's easy to get lost in the strategy and the tactics. The civilian toll that's going on both sides of this is something that we need to be mindful for when we pray about this, when we think about these things. Also, we have two different parties in this conflict that neither of which are particularly friendly to the spread of the gospel. And so when we think about this, we need to think about the Christians caught in the middle. We need to think about the people who, the innocent people who are losing their lives. Something like half of the population of the Gaza Strip is under the age of 18, right? I'm reminded of Jonah when he has his rage against the city of Nineveh. He's so mad at their policies, right? And then God rebukes him, saying, there are so many people there who don't know their left hand from their right, and many cattle besides, right? I think sometimes in our reaction, we notice the politics first, and we don't look at the innocent people caught in the middle. And I think that should guide our reaction to this from a Christian perspective, and guide the way we think and pray about it as well.
Okay. Well, thank you for your comments, and welcome to the first of what I hope are many filibuster podcast with you in it. And so with that, I yield back the balance of my time.